Welcome to Baltic World. This is Dangerous Policy Podcast. I'm Charlene.
I'm Crispin.
And this is our new podcast replacing the Week in Review. So previously we had a podcast that kind of transformed. It was kind of all over the place, what we were interested in, but we want to bring it back. And in this podcast, we'll break it down with a bit more structure. So we're going to cover world affairs and also Baltic and Eastern Europe, address some comments, and then do a catch-up.
Yes. Yeah, so things will be in a clearer format that you can break down. You can skip to what interests you. And the reason we've done it this way is prior to the rebranding of Baltic World, the channel was called Dangerous Policy, where we would discuss all kinds of issues that were facing life and society and world affairs. And some of our most popular videos where we're still drawing in new subscribers is from that era. And so in order to service that audience, but also recognize our new community with Baltic World, we've broken it up. So we've got global affairs, which will be the catch-all of what's happening in the world. It can be anywhere in the world that just happens to interest us. But then we'll also have a segment specifically on the Baltic and Eastern Europe so that we may review some of the things that we have been putting out in videos, address the comments as Charlene says, and then kind of a catch-all at the end. Yeah.
And then because the Week in Review was weekly, we don't want to put a number on this. So we'll see how we go. It might evolve over time. But thanks so much for sticking with us. So El Salvador is our world affair issue today.
Yes.
What happened in El Salvador?
Yeah. Well, first, some background context. One of the most intractable challenges that has been facing the Western world, particularly in Central and South America and the United States, is the persistent and seemingly permanent fixture that is violent gangs. The cartels are notorious. They have been running guns and weapons from the United States down into Central America while drugs flow up back to the United States. And for generations now, it has been the source of significant trauma and hardship, as well as much popular culture and movie scripts and all kind of ideas about how to challenge this, to the point where people think it's impossible to challenge, that the solution...
So entrenched in the government and the systems that they're not able to do any change. It's kind of the norm.
Absolutely. That it's exactly. It's part of the natural world that's been around so long, you know, a bit like the Queen before she died. And as a consequence, people have thought that it's impossible to change. It really has come down to two main ideologies. One being to liberalize literally everything, to make all drugs legal. And that way, in theory, you would get rid of the gangs by attacking their source of revenue, that you would have legitimate businesses taking over these industries, and as a consequence, these cartels would be run out of business. That the actual war on drugs, so to speak, was the cause of much of this hardship. The other ideology is, of course, the opposite of that we need to crack down on these violent criminals, and that we should be locking the murderers up, and that we should double down on
authoritarian approaches.
Exactly right. And the argument against that had always been, well, that just drives up the price of drugs. That if you have a cocaine shipment going from Colombia to Florida and it gets intercepted or sunk, then the price of the rest of the cocaine goes up because there's less supply and the demand remains constant. And there was a certain logic to that, except for the simple fact that you can have good people who are the good guys and the bad people are the bad guys. And if you line up all the good people to take on the bad people, you can actually make a real difference. And much to our astonishment, there has been a dramatic shift in El Salvador.
Yeah, it's amazing. So the president of El Salvador, Nayib Bukele, did a widespread crackdown on these gangs, particularly the MS-13 gang members in El Salvador, who, but basically El Salvador was like the most dangerous country in the world because everybody was part of the gang. like 1% of the population were a gang member.
Yes.
And the politicians were basically had investment in these gangs. So there was no way for a liberalized society to move El Salvador out of this mess. And essentially, he arrested all of them.
Yeah, it was an extraordinary achievement. In just 1 year, El Salvador went from being the murder capital of the whole world to a 57% drop in reported murders in 12 months. That's insane. That is a drop in crime that would usually be accommodated by like a pandemic or the Black Death. You know, it's like just something else has happened that has caused, you know, all people to stop going outside, and etc. Whereas to have a policy initiative, that is, we're going to round up everyone who's a suspected gang member. And by the way, what prompted this was a particularly bloody day in which 67 people, gang members, were killed in one day. So it was 67 sort of
67 people killed gang members. Well,
67 gang killings.
Gang kill, that's it.
Right. And the president, who's this 41-year-old guy, kind of a political insurgent from what I understand, he looks like an Avenger from Marvel. Like he looks like a celebrity, like in that sort of, you know, Captain America.
He does have a Captain America-esque. Have you seen the speech he gives? You're like, yes, courage and working together and...
Yeah,
you know,
standing, you know, the forces of good and godliness versus Satan and evil.
Yeah.
Without, you know, the Bible thumping per se, just the kind of moral clarity of, you know, evil doers bad kind of thing, and appealing to the better angels of people's nature. I mean, one of the great things that had impeded this sort of form of criminal justice before was corruption. That you'd have these gang members, they would infiltrate the police force, they would have judges in their pocket, they would extort everybody else. Anyone would be too afraid to come forward and say anything or point out, you know, who was responsible for things. And yet the president has somehow brought the entire armed, organized violence of the state on the same page. It doesn't seem like there's widespread corruption, people giving away the intentions, intelligence of various operations, or working on the side of the gang members. They've rounded up some 60,000 gang members and just thrown them in jail. As a consequence, crime goes down. And it's one of those things where people say that prison should be about rehabilitation and getting people back to you know, a more civilized life, and in principle I would agree, but one of the things that reduces crime is just getting the criminals off the street. I mean, if you look at the proportion of crime, and particularly violent crime, that is perpetuated across all of society, you can narrow that down to a very small number of people, larger number in El Salvador. And as a consequence of that, if you just deal with those people, the problem can often go away. And it seems like the president of El Salvador has done that.
It's amazing, though, that despite the crime, basically, the number of deaths reduced by over 50% in El Salvador as a result of these policies, there are still critics of El Salvador's measures. They're thinking about what are the human rights issues. They're looking at this prison that houses 40,000 prisoners, all these murderers, but they don't have proper beds. They're just in these prison cells. Like, where are their human rights?
Well, okay, so there's things like this need to be proportionate to the problem. It is, in a vacuum, correct to say that you shouldn't arrest people without probable cause, without a quick trial, without access to legal representation, and certainly humane treatment while in custody. All of these things is very important for any civilized society. But if there is a commensurate problem, then extreme measures can be taken. And we can look at the things where some of the measures may not have been proportionate, such as with the recent pandemic. Many places around the world took extremely harsh measures where governments utilized coercive powers of the state against their populations in extreme ways. capitalizing on the fear that the people had. Most of the time, it was a small minority that were actively against these policies at the time that they were being enacted. But I think if we will look back in retrospect and say, is it commensurate with the threat, that would be questionable. I guess the way to test that would be, would we do that again? Like
No.
the next wave of the pandemic with similar rates of infection and virulence, would we shut down all of society? And if the answer to that question is no, then you might say, well, that was government overreach. But if we had, if we had 67 gang killings in a single day, if we had thousands of murders every year, and gang violence, not just murders, but like the drugs, the prostitution, like the trafficking, the extortion rackets. If we had
corruption,
absolutely. If we had all of these problems, would stronger measures be accepted by the populace, or in fact demanded by the populace? And unless they had been institutionalized to accept a particular thing the way things are, then the answer would be yes. We would definitely want the government to do something. And it was extraordinary that this president has managed not only to achieve this, but to bring the instruments of the state along with him as he does this. So what's his approval rating now in El Salvador?
Over 90%. And to be honest, I wish he was my president, because I feel like, wow, I could finally see a politician doing stuff. Like, doesn't just go with the norm, actually wants to make a positive impact on the world. Oh, that's kind of nice. It's interesting. Yeah, and since then, children are able to go outside and go play in playgrounds. Previously, there were meetup points for gang members. It's simple things like that we take for granted in the West.
Oh, absolutely. If you ask a parent, okay, would you prefer for your children to be absolutely liberal in everything that they do, say, go to in their streets and so forth, but with a higher risk, indeed probability, that they'll either be victims of gang crime, they'll be dragged into gang crimes, they might be in the wrong place at the wrong time. And even if none of those things ever happened, every single day you'd be worried that it would. Or you want the strong arm of the law to come down and crush the murderous, raping gang members. And these gangs are not, like, it's not just a bad caricature. It's easy for an organization or a group of people who are otherwise pretty mild to get a bad reputation in the media. That is not the case. They are absolutely the worst of the worst. And the fact that they hadn't been dealt with previously is remarkable, absolutely astonishing, and goes to both the ideological malaise as to how to handle these issues, but also the deep-seated corruption, as Charlene says. And the fact that this guy has come along and dealt with it, not entirely, he's on his way, but almost completely suppressed gang violence in the space of 12 months by using extreme measures is amazing. And I think it goes to show that the way in which we deal with crime, yes, I understand the arguments about being tough on crime, but tough on the causes of crime, as Tony Blair once said. That, you look at homelessness, poverty, isolation, addiction, all of these issues contribute to how people end up in criminal lives, for sure. However, when people say we can't crack down on drugs because it just increases the value of pushing them, right? Well, we look at those societies which are the toughest on drugs. Singapore. Right?
Yes.
You don't go shifting drugs through Singapore, okay? And why? Because you'll be executed for doing that without much compunction on the part of the Singaporean government. And Singapore, as a consequence, does not have a drug problem, right? So when people say, oh, you're fighting human nature if you're going against supply and demand, no, I believe firmly in human nature. One of the things you could do with crime is take a Vladimir Dracula approach to crime. If you were, now I'm not saying that this is not a recommendation, but if you literally impaled everybody that did this sort of thing, you wouldn't have people doing it. There's a wonderful line in the movie, actually, Vlad the Impaler. It's a bit off topic, but I've got to.
Vlad the Impaler. Oh, that's the Romanian guy, isn't it?
Yeah. It's a great line from a movie called. The movie's called Vlad Tepes, Vlad the Impaler, and his wife, who sneaks out onto the town because she'd been isolated at a tower, she didn't know what her husband got up to. She sneaks past a sentry that's asleep and goes out to the town. And eventually the sentry is found by his superiors and Vlad's men as having fallen asleep, and he gets impaled for doing that, right? And his wife, surprisingly, screams in astonishment and terror. And it's like, how could you do this to the guy? And he's like, well, he fell asleep on duty. Which is like, so you had him killed? And he's like, my love, I promise you, the next sentry is not going to fall asleep on duty. And it's just like, there is a cold logic to that. Now, obviously, you have to draw the line a bit before that. But in the context of murdering gangs, then yes, you can be like the next young man that's thinking about how to deal with his disaffected life and how to feel a sense of belonging and connectedness may think twice about killing someone to get into a gang.
That's true. I agree with that very much so. So moving on to Baltic and Eastern Europe. We've done a few videos since our last catch up. And Lithuania is the happiest country in the world. Top 20. Yeah,
I think Finland still has that honor.
But still in the top 20, which is amazing. And all the other Baltic countries are also performing very well.
Yes, the real story kind of gets buried by that headline. The real story is that the Baltic countries have shot up through the rankings. And the reason that's unique is that not many countries do. If you have a look at the rankings over previous years, they seem to be in roughly the similar order. One might go up or down, one or two places, but it kind of indicates that there hasn't been a dramatic shift in that society relative to others. There has to be something special going on in the Baltic countries for that to happen. And I have my theories as to what that is. First of all, people are beginning to understand more and more, including within the Baltic, that Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia has everything that people actually want in Europe, but none of the drawbacks. It has the history, the culture, the wonderful landscapes, the incredible food, the music, the architecture,
their language,
spirituality, all of these things that people dream of when they dream of Europe, without all the massive drawbacks such as pollution, tourist traps, various new kind of social problems of different types of crime and changing demographics. This is something that has been preserved for future generations. Yes, they have real problems. One is the aging population, the fact that their young people are emigrating, but they don't have big social disharmony from different groups. Within the countries themselves, the large sort of Russian minorities notwithstanding, they are largely harmonious societies with similar culture and values and beliefs across the community. And I would argue the reason Finland is number one is because it has maintained its social democratic values as well as cultural identity in an environment of significant change.
Yeah, so what role does cultural identity have, impact does it have on happiness? Does it have a huge impact? I'll assume so. If you're not proud to be Lithuanian or Latvian, then you'd be very unhappy. But if you're proud then of your country and who you are, of course your happiness would.
I think, let's use a different word. It's the happiness index. But if you were to use the word confidence, that is a good proxy. So for example, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia has been on the absolute forefront of supporting Ukraine. louder and stronger and more compellingly than anyone else. But it's not just their material support and their moral support. It's the way in which they articulate why this is important. They justify it from the perspective of clear moral clarity. Universal values, human rights, rule of law, sovereignty of nationhood and individual, identity of culture, and freedom of every nation to determine its own path. And they have this absolute sense of dedication and purpose to this that's truly inspiring to the rest of the world, much of the rest of the world which has been losing that sense of confidence. And I look at Britain, look at the United States, Australia, much of the Anglo world, where they're racked with culture wars, left and right are at each other, so they're losing their sense of social cohesion. They're dealing with massive changes to their society. And they used to be the harbingers, the forefront kind of ambassadors, the forefront ambassadors of these ideologies, particularly during the Cold War when Eastern Europe was occupied by the Soviet Union. It was left to the Western powers to articulate how democracy and freedom and liberty were important. And this kind of brings us back to the El Salvador thing, where there is a trade-off. Okay, like if you have a huge amount of liberty, then you are risking security. You are allowing things to happen that wouldn't happen in a police state. There are problems that America has that China does not have. But there is a balance. And once you have a society that all agrees on a certain set of values, then liberty can flourish. And if we compare that with El Salvador, it's a great example where if you had the same principles of media freedom, social freedom in El Salvador that you have in Estonia, well, you're going to have gangs running rampant all over the place and violence and death and mayhem. But if everyone in El Salvador agreed, including the former gang members, that liberty and rule of law and freedom of the individual were values that they could all share, then they could have a high trust society and freedom and all of these other things and be a much happier society, much like the Baltic is. So in short, I think the Baltic is racing through the ranks because they have a singular clarity of purpose combined with very healthy values.
No, that's interesting. And I think that's kind of what our comments have alluded to. So, I mean, some of the comments say that it's because the rest of the world is going down. Like, the Baltic have not changed in any way, which is a fair point. It could be that too. Competition's weakening. And they all say that, like we're just balanced people. We're practical, hardworking, appreciative. Of course, there is some cynicism that the rest of the world is just declining, therefore they're rising up the ranks. But overall, because they have a shared sense of values, it does make sense.
Yes, that's a very good point. And also, one thing that isn't mentioned as much is how these countries are recovering from the occupation. Countries that have never really had it terribly good. They had the Soviet occupation, Germany, then under the Russian Empire, and like this is a real struggle for maintaining their identity and culture. And yet, at present, they're independent. They have their language, and because they're all kind of having to deal with their national consciousness, this war in Ukraine has made them all come together and realize what they all share. That has become more conscious in their minds. I think it will reduce the number of young people that choose to leave that part of the world because they realize actually there is something unique about being Lithuanian or Latvian. And I remember years ago when I first went to this part of the world, my biggest criticism was that if you ask someone what it means to be Latvian or Lithuanian or even Estonian, you wouldn't necessarily get a clear answer. That they would say things like, oh, the Soviet occupation. And then they would look at the Western culture, Britain, United States, France, and want to emulate that and want to be there, part for economic reasons, which is understandable, but also just because they absorbed that cultural colonization. Whereas now they look at their own traditions and culture and identity and realize how rich and important and how it's made them who they are. They have a stronger connection to what has made them the people that they are. And that makes them more centered and more content. And also, the recovery from the scars of the occupation as they rediscover who they truly are and have a sense of confidence in the world, then they will naturally be happier people. I think that sort of shared national awakening has connected them to other people in a way that they previously weren't. And also they're notoriously, the Baltic peoples are, and the stereotype is getting weaker, is notoriously, introvert is not even the right word, like isolationist, like very reserved. And you take a while to warm up to people and to get to know them, and then once you do, you're very strong friends. But they're not gregarious the way Australians are.
Yeah.
And Charlene is
I'm a bit loud when you know me.
Well, Charlene will speak to any random person as if she's known them their entire lives.
You don't want to be like my Uber driver because we'll end up having a good old chat and I'll know everything about your family and everything about your day.
Absolutely right. And when we are in a Uber in Lithuania, we'll have these conversations with the driver, and Charlene will build a force of connection.
I will. So what's your favorite thing about Easter?
Yeah, exactly. And it's good. It works really well. And the Baltic peoples are not known for that, but I think their sense of, connecting to one another is getting better over time. And I think that's one of the reasons. So you could say, the rest of the world's just getting worse. I mean, there might be some truth to that, but I think the whole world is discovering what's great about the Baltic, including the Baltic people. And that's the biggest explanation for that. So that's why I think it's significant. The story that got buried was how much all of the Baltic countries have raced through the ranks, and how rare that is. Because you can look at people go through various charts and things go up and down all the time. There are all kinds of lists that aren't that significant, and you go up 50 places or down 25 and you just don't think about it. But to move it all, let alone as much as these countries have, is a significant story.
And then alongside this, we're actually kind of just rediscovering the Baltic a bit, because we've relaunched the history of Lithuania. So that part 4 is finally out. Thank you so much for your patience. It was one of those things where we just really wanted to get it right, or I wanted to get it right, definitely. And the problem is, there's just fragments everywhere across the internet, and you just don't know. You're trying to marry up a story from Lithuania's perspective, Russia and Poland, and it was very interesting. So glad that people enjoyed that.
And by the way, if you have enjoyed it, know that Charlene did the script, the research, the editing, pretty much the whole shebang. And just on a personal note, that demonstrates just how far Charlene has come in this journey. From the first time I ever talked about Lithuania being where on earth is Lithuania, to, I think, a genuine Baltic expert, as well as a really skilled video editor. If you haven't checked that video out, go and check it out. We've got the History of Lithuania series. We're up to part 4. Obviously, each video has gotten significantly better because there's been a lot of time between drinks. Part 4 video really showcases just how excellent the production quality has gotten. I really enjoy watching that video. I'm sure you will as well. So do yourself a favor and watch it. And we're doing part 5 in due course.
So we're doing part 5. I learnt a lot though doing the part 4 of History of Lithuania, and just a greater appreciation for what it's like to be occupied by another country and then having to protect your language and culture. Because obviously, being Australian, I don't have that kind of experience. I'm free to do what I want, free to do what I say. And yet when you read the stories, I felt really sad. But it really made me appreciate the things that the the Baltics have gone through and understand why Ukraine is such an important country and what's happening right now. Because, it could be any country.
Yes, it's extraordinary. And I mean, Ukraine, we'll discuss a lot more about Ukraine in due course, but it is so important that this gets resolved in the best possible way, which is to push Russia out of Ukraine entirely, and for the rest of the world to recognize that happened in that way, that it doesn't just fizzle into some political compromise, but we have a winner and a loser.
Yeah, for sure. And then security for entire Eastern Europe. That's the best outcome. But then we also, on a fun note, we've launched Baltic mythology series. Now, what inspired you to want to do this?
Fundamentally, I mean, okay, it depends on how long you want this answer to be, because this is fundamentally what got me interested in the region in the first place. So the Baltic, and Lithuania in particular, was the last kingdom in Europe to be Christianized. And not by a little bit, not by like a year, but by close to 100 years after the entirety of the every politic around them in every direction for thousands of kilometers was monotheistic. They had the Orthodox Christians to the east, the Latin Christians to the west, the Golden Horde to the south. And so you had the preservation of a particular belief system and oral religious tradition that was carried over from the pre-Roman era, with a lot of linkages across all Indo-European civilizations preserved well into the High Middle Ages. And yet, if we compare the understanding that we have from the sagas of the Norse to the classical Roman and Greek traditions, the Egyptians, things that go back thousands of years earlier, we know so much more about all of these traditions. We know much more about the religious practices of the ancient Hittites than we know of the Baltic region. And the reason for that, of course, is written records, that these places all had written records that survive, and the Baltic region doesn't, sadly. And so a lot of it is piecing things together through a variety of means. And when we finish the series, I know people have been asking about this in the comments, where are your sources, how are you doing this? At the end of the series, we will have a deep dive into how we did each video, our reasons for making some inclusions and some exclusions. We are not the font of truth.
No.
This is, we've had to make judgments based upon the variety of sources, the strength of those sources, and what makes sense in the context of the mythology as we understand it, and comparative mythology where we find gaps. Like, what would be logical to complete a worldview? But a lot of this could be wrong, and we have to be humble about this. But it is really important to do, because the Lithuanian mythology, like the Lithuanian state, the Grand Duchy of Lithuania, which at one point was the largest in Europe, stretched from the Black Sea up to the Baltic Sea, has contributed an outsized amount to European civilization and culture, much greater than its present borders would indicate. And yet we still don't know that much, or the average person does not know that much about it. And so we all lose out as a consequence of this. I mean, my passion for the Baltic comes from that under-researched aspect. As someone who's history obsessed, the fact that I know more about, Amenhotep III than, let's say, Mendigus, that's outrageous. It's absolutely, it's absurd when I think about it in those terms. And so to try and build those fragments up and build the awareness, part of it is to kind of showcase Lithuanian stories, part of it is to entertain, and part of it is to try and get more research into this area.
Agreed.
I mean, we just need because it can be done. If we go out and do the archaeology, we can do it. It can be done. People are digging up Romania, getting all kinds of information about ancient Dacia that we didn't know about, the pre-Roman region of what is now Romania. We could do the same in Lithuania. We could get that work done, but it requires people to know that there's stuff there and to care. My interest in the region came from these stories. Egle, Queen of the Serpent, was this mystery. There's a statue in Canberra, which is a pagan Lithuanian statue. It's the only pagan Lithuanian statue outside of Lithuania.
It's amazing.
It happens to be in the capital of Australia, and it's a beautiful statue.
Yeah.
And the story of that statue put me on this journey that happened all these years ago.
No, that's a beautiful explanation. Yeah, it's amazing, and I'm really excited for this series. Putting it together has been a lot of fun because a lot of these Baltic mythology stories have come all relates to nature, so that's why you have so much people love nature. Everything's just beautiful and magical. I guess it makes sense. Like, how does the world work? It's part of the origin for these stories. So,
absolutely. I mean, you think about what is unique to that region, where there are thousands of lakes and rivers, way more than the average you would find elsewhere. The winters are extreme. Winters are cold.
They've got distinct seasons.
Yeah, extremely distinct seasons. Amber used to wash up on the shore. And you have deep green forests.
Yeah.
Very dense, hard to explore. And all of these things in this one region. So if you have these experiences, then obviously that's going to shape your understanding of the world because that's your experience of the world. This is a time long before the internet where it's highly unlikely that anyone in Lithuania of the 12th century had a concept of the Sahara Desert, right? So it's not going to be part of their imaginative mythology. But other things are. So, yeah, nature is a big factor. There is, of course, significant overlap between Lithuania and other Indo-European cultures. And one of the things that I should have mentioned as to why this is important is that Lithuania has the oldest language still spoken in Europe. If you go back prior to Latin for thousands of years, Proto-Indo-European, the first migrations to that region, spoke a kind of version of Lithuanian, which means that the stories that are spoken in Lithuanian are probably very old stories. And thus, if we can preserve them and carry them forward, then we are reaching into the distant past that is otherwise a forgotten memory in our prehistory. How have you felt about making the stories and when by making the stories, doing the editing and the visuals and cutting it all together?
Yeah, no, it's been an interesting journey. I think I've learned a lot more just about, again, Lithuanian mythology. It's interesting because I'm trying to look for artwork in this space, and it's incredibly difficult to find out what Divus looks like, or Divus looks like. That's one thing. One thing that's really stressed me about this whole Lithuanian mythology series is our pronunciation of any of these gods and goddesses.
Yeah.
Man, we are being judged so bad. Know that we're two Australians from the other side of the world that we just love your country.
Yeah, I understand. For the Lithuanians, there,
it's like
your ears are bleeding. I'm sorry. Yeah.
Imagine that. Imagine somebody, Crispin, saying your name is Crispin.
Yeah, that's okay. I mean, I'd be very forgiving, guys. That's how I would be. But actually, there's a book I had noticed on the shelf there that you've been reading that was recommended to us. You want to grab that for the audience? Many of you will recognize
this
Lithuanians.
One, yes, and it's starting to make more sense to me now, doing the editing and listening to the stories a bit more. So I'm able to kind of piece together where the gods sit and why they're important in relation to the stories in this book and all the linguistic observations. They're very random.
Yeah.
For those who read this book.
So this was recommended to us. Thank you so much. It's For Gods and Men.
Of Gods and Men
by Algirdas Grimus. Yeah. And he is a linguistics specialist. He has a fascinating life story. And he's at the forefront of constructing where particular ideas came from in terms of Lithuanian mythology based upon the way in which the words are used to describe them. So it's a really good exercise in forensic linguistics to be like, okay, well, this story probably came from this region of Samagodia because it uses this dialect structure and the stories refer with these names and these names typically come from this region. So it's a really good exercise in forensics. It's dense to read.
So dense.
So Charlene has put in a lion effort to actually get her head around it, and she's come across some really cool, funky stories which we might save.
We'll save them, but I don't know if they're real stories. They probably are. Where it starts here and then ends all the way around somewhere else. They're interesting stories, and I'm glad that this book does exist, but I just wish it was just like an A to B story, or A, B, C story, right? You have like the protagonist, and you have a villain, then you have like the problem and an ending, but it's not like that at all. It's all these snippets where you just kind of like, I think he means this, and then go away and research a bit more. It's like, okay.
That's a great point. In fact, I might take this opportunity to quickly mention that when we are done with the series, we will be relying on our discussions with you guys to refine and change. Because as I said, we've made judgments based on things for the series, but these are not the font of truth. We don't have the same personal attachment to it as some others. Yeah. So there will be an opportunity for dialogue. I mean, like, we actually think that this story should include this element, or this should be changed, and this reflects my understanding growing up, and this is where I got it from. We will have that dialogue, and then once we have an agreed mythology in the series, we will reconvert it into something else. We won't give that away yet, but this is a book that is not accessible for the average person. It requires deep study to interpret and understand. It wasn't really written as a cultural asset for people just to randomly pick up and have. But there is an opportunity with the series to do that, and other things we will do with it once it's done. So stay tuned for that. And if you have heard a different story, this is the biggest disclaimer, and maybe we should have put this at the first episode, but that's fine. We'll do it again.
Put it in the comments and it will let us know.
Yeah, this is not the only version of the stories that exist, okay? The thing that keeps coming up again and again and again is that every single god or spirit or story has multiple variants from different regions, and you would have heard things that are different to what we've said. Now, that does not mean that it's wrong and that we are claiming authority that ours is right. We have our methodology for why we've made the choices we've made, but we accept that there are equal, not even like with some sort of conceit, there are equal arguments for going in a different direction. And so please do leave your versions in the comments below. We will absolutely read them and pick them up in our roundup episodes. And at the very end, we will do a roundup reflection on the exercise. We've got many more to come, though, before that happens.
Yeah, many more, and it's exciting. So, yeah, you'll see a lot more nature pictures or more B-roll. And thing is, like I said, it's really difficult to find artwork of these god and goddesses. Like, they're just based on interpretations of what people heard from what they're growing up and what they've seen, reading, small paragraphs of how people describe things. So they're very varied. So what I've done is AI is on the rise, and I've used AI to make pictures. So you can put prompts in these AI to just kind of, make different characters. So they've evolved over time, but this is where I've interpreted. So again, please tell me if this is definitely not meaningless in the comments, because I've got an old man. Who knows? It's an old man. Lots of interpretation there, but we can literally create something really special now with the new technology that we've got and my editing skills.
Look, it's one of those things. If you haven't seen the series yet, if you're just listening to this for reasons completely unrelated to the Baltic, go to our channel, check out the Lithuanian mythology series. Every one is in short snippets. They're easy to binge, and they're just beautifully constructed. And I know, obviously, we're publishing the videos,
so
and therefore it's biased. But I enjoy listening to it. I enjoy like the music. I enjoy the way it's cut. I enjoy the visuals. I enjoy the story. And I enjoy how they link together. And I feel like I'm getting to know the characters involved and how people would relate to these deities and what the value systems were. If you just have even a cursory interest in any pagan mythology, go check it out. It's, if nothing else, an enjoyable listen. It's an easy listen.
Yeah, it's like a bedtime story.
Mm.
Spoken by Crispin. Okay.
Unless you're a native Lithuanian speaker and have to listen to my pronunciation, then it's getting sandpaper rubbed against your ears. But otherwise,
but we're improving. We're improving. Chalet is Sole.
Sole, yeah.
So this is our reflection section. And it's free for all. So there was a video that we published not too long ago where we tried to take down International Foreign Policy Organization, Crispin. Why did we try to do that?
Yeah, so there is an organization called Foreign Policy Magazine. It's a legacy institution. It's the largest foreign policy publication in the world by readership. Okay, there are more prestigious organizations, but that is the one that has the widest distribution. Now, I know everybody out there loves our idea, restored Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. And it's something that I don't take a back step from. I think is a really great idea, and I think can be justified. And I've made the arguments for it in other videos, and also the arguments for why I think the anxieties about it can be they're real. They're absolutely valid. You don't want Poland, for example, just taking over everything, or a block emerging between different populations. You want every minor player to have a strong voice.
Yeah,
but I think those challenges can be met. Anyway, so one thing I can say with confidence is that it was our idea and that we can defend it even if we have people who disagree with it. Well, there was another figure, foreign policy analyst with a lot of credentials, no excuse. He comes from a significant alumni, he knows better, published an article in Foreign Policy Magazine calling for the resurrection of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth and claiming the idea as his own. And using the same arguments that I use, except much worse. I don't think he understands the topic, to be frank. And it's obvious, to me at least, that he drew that from our work and our videos.
But how do you know that?
Well, first of all, it's an incredibly unique idea. That it's not something that has been on the agenda until we presented it. So that's number one. Just the timing of it was big. It happened within a few weeks. And the arguments are eerily similar. The wording of his article has been changed in the sense of it's altered sufficiently from ours that he leaves out some of the more contentious issues.
Yeah, and he calls it like the Polish-Lithuanian Union. Like, who does that? It's a Commonwealth. It's a Commonwealth.
Exactly right. It's absurd. But then, of course, the most damning thing was when I reached out to him and I reached out to Foreign Policy Magazine, and they did not deny it, is all I'll say.
True.
So that's a pretty compelling thing. And they didn't deny it. They didn't give any alternative explanation as to where they got the information from or the arguments thereof, and also how easy it is to access our work if you simply type restore Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth into Google. Go do that now and see where our video shows up. I guarantee you it's the top. So we have, and I don't mean YouTube, I mean Google search engine. Like if you were doing any basic level research. Now, I don't have a problem at all that this has been taken up by Foreign Policy Magazine. Like, the actual goal should be advanced, and Foreign Policy Magazine is the highest distribution foreign policy journal in the world. The problem is that there was no attribution, and one of the things that foreign policy has been known to do is want to get the fresh ideas out there and refuse to acknowledge where things really came from. And that's dangerous. It steals other people's IP. And of course, in this case, mine. But it gives them the kind of bragging credentials that they actually came up with legacy ideas or published legacy ideas. And in this case, they haven't. And they weren't willing to change their article to reflect the actual attribution. And they didn't give an alternative explanation as to how they plausibly came up with this otherwise. So we decided to react.
Yes, very much. Like, it was a 4-day hustle. Not even joking, from like 8 to 1 a.m. every day. Trying to get this video up in time.
Tells you how much energy revenge can give you.
Suddenly. And it was such a fun edit. Like, I've never had so much fun editing a video. I mean, obviously, it's changed now because mythology videos are now out. But prior to that, I was like, man, this has reinvigorated Charlene's like imagination. How do I make? Because I love things like that. I not like takedown videos, but I love things where you're able to tell an intelligent story, but in an entertaining and funny way. That is rich and that you learn something. And we did that. We taught people what foreign policy is. Then we went into like the actual like reasoning why Polish Lithuanian Commonwealth was important to us. Then we went to like, how do you search for our video, and how. And I got to put your head on Astronaut. Like, it was amazing.
You guys, if you haven't seen the video, like, forget Polish Lithuanian Commonwealth. What makes this video fun isn't the arguments or what happened. It's the actual video itself. It is the funniest video of its kind out there on YouTube. Of takedown videos, this is just the masterclass. And I say this obviously as someone who is a subject of it, but Charlene rips into me as much as she does my opponents in this video. And it's all because of the way she edits it. So go and check it out. We'll leave a link down below. And if you are interested at all in Schadenfreude, kind of like, you know, videos that expose people that really deserve it, you can't do better than this. I mean, in fact, even if I was on the other side of this, if I was the subject of the video and someone had made a takedown video that was that good, I'd have to tip my hat and be like, that's a hell of a thing. So hopefully that it follows this guy. I won't even name him here. It follows this guy around him everywhere, because it was a shocking thing. Like, if this was some grad student in some university, I'd kind of expect it. But this isn't. This is some... with a PhD, and... he's an alumni of various institutes. Yeah. He has a long pedigree of foreign policy accolades. And to try and steal something like this and openly claim it as his own is just outrageous. And yeah, you should check out that video. Watch it right now. For sure. Well, that's all the time we have for today. So any questions, any comments, please leave them down below. Do you like the new format? Let us know. Otherwise, stay safe and ciao for now.